There seems to be a scene often in movies or in stories where the villain, usually it's a larger man who looks sort of opulent and maybe even touched slovenly, but just clearly he's the bad guy. There's something he does which is religious in nature. And maybe he goes into a church, maybe he gives some money to a priest, maybe he goes in for confession, but he does something religious. And the scene is designed to show us something about the depth of the man's depravity, the villain's depravity, that though on the side he may be killing someone or hurting someone or stealing something or extorting and running some sort of mafia, like that he has the gall, he has just the depravity that necessary to still attempt in some sense to be religious. And I think it's showing us, through this interesting contrast, something we know we just inherently understand, that what we do religiously or spiritually, it cannot be disconnected from how we live. In other words, religious activity minus righteousness accomplishes nothing. And this is what the passage this morning in Isaiah is telling us. So the people have gathered for a special time of fasting and prayer. So they're fasting and praying, but they're also crying out saying, Lord, why isn't this working? And the answer is simply because you're doing this religious activity, but you're doing it without connecting it to righteous living. In other words, it's merely activity. It's merely ritual. And it says here that in the midst of their fasting, this is what it says. They're asked the question, why have we fasted, God, and you have not seen it, in Isaiah 58, verse 3. And here's the answer in 58, the second part of that same verse, 58:3. Behold, in the day of your fast you seek your own pleasure and oppress all your workers. And it goes on to say, and you continue to fight and argue. God's making the point here that religious activity, it can't be disconnected from the way we live. In other words, we don't just go and do spiritual things and then live however we want. That true spirituality is connected to how we live. And God goes on in this passage to say, if you want me to hear your prayer, then you can't just do religious activities. You can't just participate in religious rituals. You actually have to follow and obey what I say. And he really boils it down to a few different things in Isaiah 58, verse 7. He says, is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and bring the homeless poor into your house, when you see the naked to cover him, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh? God's saying that you cannot separate the first and second commandment. You cannot pretend to love God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, to worship God, to say you serve God, to do these different activities and religious activities aimed in some sense at relationship with God, while not only just ignoring, harming and hurting other people. In other words, we as Christians can't say, hey, I'm right with God, that's good enough, I can treat people however I like. That these two things must go together. That for God to hear our prayers, for our fasting, for our worshiping, for our singing, for all of this, actually, it to be real, it needs to be evidenced in a changed heart that loves other people, that serves other people, that looks for people in need and helps them. So, Redeemer, I think this, in this time, really raises for us a question. I love how we have been committed to each other during this time. It just warms my heart to see your commitment to watching the services on Sunday, to watching these different devotionals, to participating in Bible studies. That is wonderful. It's a demonstration of loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. But we must never disconnect that from loving other people. We must never disconnect that from the way we do our work, from the way we live with our families, from the way we walk around our neighborhoods. That love for God must evidence itself in love for other people. Otherwise, there's this disconnect that God condemns. But God says, and this passage really is an encouragement, He says, if you'll not only love me, but you'll follow me and love others, if you'll not just perform religious duties, but you'll actually act out in righteousness towards others, He's like, but then your fasting will do good. Because this is how it ends. In verse 9 it says, then you shall call and the Lord will answer. You shall cry, and he will say, Here I am. If you take away the yoke from your midst, the pointing of the finger, and speaking wickedness, if you pour yourself out for the hungry, and satisfy the desire of the afflicted, then shall your light rise in the darkness, and your gloom be as the noonday. God is simply saying, when the heart transformation, when it's evident in the way you live and treat others, He's like, that's when I respond. So let us just be very careful, Redeemer, that we don't put all of our energy and effort simply into religious ceremony without looking for ways to serve, love, and bless others. This is what God desires. He wants us to love Him with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And this is what Christ has modeled for us. This follows those great passages about the servant who not only loved God with all of his heart, but he loved people enough to offer himself in their place. Redeemer, are we loving others? Are we caring for others? Is what we profess with our tongues in worship lived out with our hands in the way we treat others around us? Let's make sure that's how we're living as followers of Jesus Christ.